If there's one thing about which I would wager most of us in this room would agree, it's that reading the news these days is not exactly an exercise in uplift. Midweek, I had a conversation with a Temple Emmanuel member who's a mental health professional. And I asked, what would you advise someone who's working to maintain emotional resilience in today's world? His reply, stop reading the news. Which is why I was struck this week, amidst a particularly heartbreaking barrage of news both here in America and abroad, to read in the Times of Israel an observation by Felissa Kramer, who wrote, when 4 young Israeli soldiers were released from Gaza over the weekend, many people noticed their braided hair. Braided hair? Not usually a news headline, but Kramer went on to share that these braids were attributed to Agam Berger, who at the time was still in Hamas captivity. Awaiting her release this week, all over Israel and in some Jewish day schools here in America, those with hair long enough to do so welcomed Agam home by braiding their hair. El Al Airlines posted a photo of their team members with beautiful long braids and the caption, despite knowing she herself would remain behind, Agam braided the hair of her fellow hostages. Through this simple yet powerful act, she turned the braids into a symbol of strength, love, humanity, resilience, and power. I've been thinking about that post and about those braids, the ones that Agam braided, and the ripple effect that they've made as a symbol of the kind of faith that is so often lost to us in dark times, because it's easy to get overwhelmed by the horror. There's certainly plenty of it to go around, but it's hard in a world which gives us every reason to give up and to give in, to nevertheless braid. What gives some people that power while others watch and wonder? In one of those hours that I'm never quite sure whether to call late at night or early in the morning, my phone pinged with a WhatsApp from our March of the Living tour guide who lives in Israel, Shelley Trachtenberg. She had forwarded me a piece by Rachel Sharansky-Danziger. And as soon as I read it, there was no way I was going back to sleep. She wrote, once I went through a period that seemed difficult to me at the time. And she said, I complained to my father, Natan Sharansky, that I was miserable. Let me tell you, he replied, what happened to me during difficult times in the Gulag. That sentence alone, she wrote, immediately reminded me of how good and easy my life actually was. And then she shared that although she took from his words a gentle chide, what she also took from his words were a life lesson that changed from that moment forward how she approached hardship that she encountered. You see, her father understood his imprisonment as a way to, in his words, break him. In response, he said, I knew that if I felt I had no ability to influence my life, I would be far more vulnerable. So every day I asked myself, what are the big goals I want to achieve? And what can I do today, right now, to advance them? That's almost impossible to imagine. There he is in prison, and he's focusing on the future. He's asking himself, what can I do now? Towards a vision that I have no idea whether it can be realized or not. And yet he goes on to reflect that it is that vision which enabled him to strategize small ways to maintain his agency, which turns out to be a core insight for thriving through trial, any trial. He continued, as she reported, sometimes it was something very small, like exercising in the cell to maintain my strength, or eating or not eating, or refusing to speak to the KGB agent trying to tempt me into compromise. But that was enough, because it meant I still had control over my life. I was still serving my own goals and not those of my captors, even if they could decide where I would be, with whom, what I would wear, what I would eat, and so on. The hostages this week that Israel welcomed home with a mix of elation to see them and heartbreak for what they have endured reflect, she said, that kind of resilience. She continued, when Agam observed Shabbat, when she and her friends tried to fast on Yom Kippur, when Gadi clung to the hope of someday rebuilding near Oz, they achieved the impossible. They marked for themselves an inner space where their captors' goals had no foothold, a space where even in an unimaginable reality, they chose who they wanted to be, which is, frankly, amazing, heroic. And for every one of us here today thinking, well, that's obvious, that's Natan Sharansky, that's Agam, that's Gadi, that's not me. There are Agam's braids. The power of the braids is not just the message conveyed through those who received them from her hand back to Israel, but the power is in each of us who choose our own way to pick up that message in our own lives today, that the smallest of deeds can have the biggest of impact, that our vision of what can be builds our capacity to endure and transcend what is. This is a Torah not just for captives, but for every single one of us today. And our Parsha gives us this out loud. How? Have you ever wondered why, in the middle of an increasingly dramatic tale of the 10 plagues, just as they're about to build to a crescendo, the narrative suddenly comes to a screeching halt to give way to a dry recitation of laws about Israel's calendaring system? In chapter 11, we're at the pinnacle of drama, Pharaoh and God in a cosmic standoff. And chapter 12 begins with intricate instructions about which month in the calendar will start and how to observe Passover, a lamb and some matzah and some bitter herbs, not just for that moment, but in future generations. Even going on to imagine that someday a generation of children will ask, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem? What is this to you? Why go there? Because buried in plain sight here is the transmission of the most important lesson our Jewish tradition has to offer, Our greatest strength, our deepest resilience is our vision of not just what is, but of what can be. Even in literally the darkest moment, the plague of darkness, we envision that someday we'll be sitting around a full table, safe, free, and this suffering will be so far away that our children won't even remember it. By the way, in case we miss the power of that vision, the Torah continues that every day we're going to wrap tefillin and speak words of Torah to remind us that wherever we are, personally, nationally, globally, that this can happen. That we can be for 430 years in desperation, and suddenly everything can change. It's an idea that can feel in our times quaint and even naive. But as Natan Sharansky's insight and Agam Berger's experience emphasize, it is the eternal secret to our survival. A vision of what can be creates the conditions for us to make our way towards it. What is your vision? If you don't have one or you feel like you're losing the one that you had, it is time to recommit, to make it concrete again, even if it seems far away. Danny Gordis shared in his Israel from the Inside newsletter earlier this week a song that has surprisingly taken Israel by storm. It's called Sof Tov, a good end. And like John Lennon's Imagine, it invites us to imagine a world beyond the current conflict. But unlike Imagine, it invites some very specific dreams. A world where the residents of the North and the South can go safely home again, where Israelis can travel around the world, including to places unimaginable today, in safety and without fear. And it ends, at least we'll start with a good ending. Start with a good ending. What would it look like for us today to start with a good ending? To pause our narrative of what the world is, what our lives are, what feels out of control and impossible, to conjure a vision of what we would want it to be, and then ask, as Sharansky before us, what can I do today, right now, to advance towards that vision? As Agam Berger finally, after 482 days of captivity, returned home, she was photographed as she was being transported to the hospital, holding a whiteboard on which she had scribbled, "I chose the path of faith, and in faith I returned." May we, who are so free, today, here, do no less. Shabbat shalom.